Relatives. This is Mark Charles. It is about almost 4 o'clock Eastern Time on Friday, July 9th, and I'm sitting down to begin going through my online book study for the book I co-authored, Unsettling Truth, the ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. This week we are looking at Chapter 7, and Chapter 7 of this book is titled Dysfunctional Theology and the Spread of Settler Colonialism. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit more in depth about this chapter today. But before I begin, let me do as I always do by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from my home in Washington, D.C., which is located on the traditional land of the Piscataway. I want to honor the Piscataway for being the host people, the indigenous nation of these lands, and I want to thank them humbly for their stewardship of these lands. So, Chapter 7, well, there's several things I want to do today, and one of them is I want to highlight that it was a few weeks ago, actually not even that, it was several months ago, I was contacted by Sarah Augustine, and she has been doing a lot of work, especially within the church, on the Doctrine of Discovery for a number of years. And she contacted me and said that she had written a book and was in the process of getting it published, and they wanted to know if I would be willing to write a foreword for the book. And I was very excited to consider that opportunity. So I asked if they would send me a copy of the book, and they did. She sent me a copy of the book. The book is titled "The Land Is Not Empty," and I read the book. And I decided I absolutely wanted to write a foreword for it. So I submitted my foreword to the publisher, and we were able to get it the way they wanted it for the copy. And the book was released last month in June. It came out, and today, actually, as I was just preparing for this live stream, I got 2 copies of the book in the mail. And so this is the book by Sarah Augustine. I just want to hold it up for you. It's called The Land Is Not Empty. I highly recommend this book. I will probably be doing a live stream over my second cup of coffee next week to talk more specifically about the book and why I think it's such a good book for people to read. But I've read the book cover to cover. I very much endorse it and think it's a fantastic book to have. And I want to encourage people, if you would like to learn more about Sarah's journey and to understand more about her perspective on the Doctrine of Discovery, to read this book. It's called The Land Is Not Empty, and I have the humble honor of writing the foreword for that book. So I wanted to let people know that is out. That now I want to go through Chapter 7. And Chapter 7 of our book, The Ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery, Unsettling Truth, is introducing the concept of settler colonialism and eventually genocide. So let me share a link here. If you are interested in this book and want to learn more about the Doctrine of Discovery, I'm sharing a link to my website where you can purchase a signed copy of Unsettling Truth, and we usually get those in the mail within 24 hours. So if you would like to get a copy of Unsettling Truth, I encourage you to go to my website. You can also get it almost anywhere else online, but if you want a signed copy of it, you can get that from my website at wirelesshogan.com. So again, in these studies, I'm not necessarily reiterating everything we put into each of the chapters, but I'm trying to give you a bit more background and some more in-depth discussion on things that take place in each of these chapters. And the chapter that we started here actually began with an interaction I had online with somebody. And I'm just going to read this first few paragraphs because it's kind of fascinating. It says, if slavery were legal, I'd probably have 2 myself. That would not have made me a racist. I, Mark, get my fair share of ignorant comments on my social media, but that one took the cake. A few minutes later, another person commented, challenging the above statement as dehumanizing and calling for this person to have a heart. But the individual quickly shot back, on the contrary, my dear, I have a big heart, but the law is the law. I would have slaves, but I wouldn't treat them harshly because, after all, we're all human. Last time I checked, slavery was acceptable back in the Bible days. So slavery was cool with God. It's cool with me. You almost don't know what to say, right? What do you say to that? I remember when I first saw those comments on my social media, I was fairly astounded that someone would so blatantly say something like that, especially in this modern day and age. But it revealed a deeply held implicit bias, an implicit racial bias, which is that of superiority. The fact that this person was even contemplating the institution of slavery and assumed that they would be in the role of a slave owner rather than one of the enslaved, again, reveals the implicit racial bias. Because slavery in our nation is absolutely tied to race. And it's absolutely tied to an understanding of who is believed to be inferior and who is believed to be superior. And so we open this chapter up with a discussion on implicit racial bias. And the challenge with our implicit biases, is frequently we don't even know what these biases are. They're implicit. They're things we just assume to be true. And so we often don't know that we hold these biases until they get pointed out or until we somehow get slapped in the face with them and understand, oh my gosh, these are not good biases. These are not healthy things to understand or believe or to assume. And that's the difference between something that's implicit and something that's explicit. And as you've heard me say in the past, this is largely the difference between the Democratic Party's stances on race and the Republican Party's stances on race. The Republicans are just they're explicitly white supremacists. They know that their base is white landowners. They know that the more they can enrage and excite that demographic, the better chance they're going to have of winning their elections. And so, not even begin with Donald Trump, but he was the most recent example. They absolutely are explicitly racist, sexist, and white supremacists because that's how they attract their base. Now, the problem with the Democrats is they're not much different. They have a more diverse base, but they still absolutely believe in the lie of white supremacy. And they are still very much controlled by white landowning men from the 1%. But because they have a more diverse base, they have to make their biases much more implicit rather than explicit. So Donald Trump said, "Make America Great Again." Hillary Clinton said, "America's great already." President Obama said, "America's great already." Cory Booker said, "Our history of enslavement and our dehumanizing documents don't detract from our greatness whatsoever." Again, this is just, it's implicit versus explicit. And so we're trying to point that out in the early chapters of this book. And this, of course, this is not a new idea. This is stuff we've been building up on all the chapters previous to this as we talk about this dysfunctional theological understanding. And now we're looking at how it applies to the spread of settler colonialism. And so going into the first section of this book, of this chapter, the persistent expression of a diseased imagination, we start talking about the Second Great Awakening, and we, of course, start talking about manifest destiny, which comes into play in the early 1800s. And I want to read this quote on page 101. It says, "If the 13 colonies had been founded by an exceptional people with superior physical, intellectual, and spiritual character, and spiritual characteristics, that exceptionalism would have no choice but to seek expansion. The Doctrine of Discovery had encouraged the conquest of a lesser people by a greater people. Therefore, the exceptional Anglo-Saxon people of the 13th colonies would need to expand their influence and power. America saw itself as a bulwark of Western civilization centered on belief in God. And in the 21st century, most Americans continue to believe that their nation is indispensable and exceptionable. The concept of exceptionalism remains the guiding paradigm of self-identification for most Americans." So we're really trying to hit home the point that this diseased theological understanding, this belief in the superiority of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, is becoming the implicit bias of the nation, and it's framing itself in the understanding of American exceptionalism. And American exceptionalism, if you're raised here, if you are born and raised, if you, most even around the country, around the world, this mythology of American exceptionalism is fed to you at every single turn. And most Americans end up believing it just because it's reinforced so frequently in our educational system, in our churches, in our politics, in our financial systems, in our commerce. We drive home this point of American exceptionalism over and over and over again. So it becomes the guiding framework of the entire country. And this is just it being acknowledged. And we see this. So we go back and how we see this in as our nation begins to expand, as we expand through Manifest Destiny, as we expand through purchases, things like the Louisiana Purchase, and even as we look at some of the songs being written back in the early 19th century, and we look on page 102 at the song America the Beautiful. And it says, we see a blatant conflation of American greatness with Christian faith. A hymn sung in church would be steeped in the dysfunctional social imagination of American greatness and the inevitability of American triumph. The lyrics speak of a majestic land of amber waves of grain, purple mountain majesties, and fruited plain that has been conquered by heroes, proved in liberating strife, who more than self their country loved. That was a quote. Both the social and theological imagination are embedded within the prayer, God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. This Christian hymn explicitly justifies the white Christian American quest for manifest destiny. And so we look at how this understanding of superiority becomes a part of our civil religion, our white nationalistic form of Christianity. And it becomes manifest in our belief in manifest destiny, in the songs that we sing, even songs to honor our country and our nation, and even the way we begin to look back and to frame our history. We then go on in this book to look at how this belief in white superiority gets even more explicitly played out in our founding documents. So now that we have a constitution and a Declaration of Independence that absolutely state and affirm the lie of white supremacy. And so the way that gets reinforced throughout the history of our nation is through our court rulings, right? The Supreme Court, whose job is to interpret the Constitution, now needs to use these dehumanizing foundations as it begins to build the pillars of our nation. And so we see this, and one of the cases we highlight is the 1856 case of the Dred Scott decision, which, again, interpreting the Constitution, states that African Americans, Black people, were not protected by the Constitution. They were never intended to be included as citizens of this land. Now, this is where things start to get fascinating, because our nation has been wrestling with the dynamic, especially between the white and Black races, for almost all of its history. This is because of the way we constructed the Black race by allowing, by the one drop rule, which expanded because Black people, African Americans, were the labor force. We used the one drop rule to expand that race so that there could be more people to enslave. And this really put black and white dynamics at the forefront of our social interactions. And so our nation has been wrestling with racism through the black-white paradigm for almost all of its history. And as a result, we've had things like the civil rights movement. We've had things like the redefining of slavery from chattel slavery into what we have now within our criminal justice system. We've had Jim Crow laws and segregation. And now we're having movements like Black Lives Matter, and we're having even what happened just a few weeks ago where the House of Representatives passed a bill basically removing all Confederate statues from the U.S. Capitol. And this included the bust of Roger Taney, who was the author of the 1856-57 Dred Scott decision that declared that people of African descent were not U.S. citizens. And so our Congress just passed a bill saying we're going to remove these statues. We're going to remove Confederate statues because, again, well, I'll go into this in a minute, because he wrote the opinion that said African people were not citizens. We're not allowed to be citizens. Now, this is the problem of how we're addressing race in our country. This is absolutely where the problem manifests itself. Because we're not addressing racism. We're not addressing white supremacy. We're not addressing the flaws at a foundational level, but we're not even addressing them as foundational level problems or as systemic issues. We're addressing them like they were the result of a few bad apples. And so the Confederates, even though both the Union and the Confederacy were blatantly white supremacists, including Abraham Lincoln, because the Confederates lost the war, we are now trying to remove them from our history. And so we're taking down statues of Confederate generals. And now we're removing this bust of Roger Taney, who wrote the Dred Scott decision. Now, I'm not arguing we should be honoring Confederate generals, nor am I arguing that we should be honoring Roger Taney. We shouldn't be. But because we're addressing these problems like these were the bad apples who were ruining this great narrative of the American story, this is where we don't understand the problem. Right? Roger Taney actually had a fairly good understanding of what the Constitution was meant to do, which, if you've ever read it, is to protect the interests of white landowning men. Read the first draft of the Constitution that was passed in 1787. That document in no way, shape, or form was intended to grant rights or protections to Native peoples or African people. It absolutely was not. Didn't even count Africans as fully human. Didn't even include natives, didn't even include women. Roger Taney had a fairly good grasp, a fairly decent understanding on what the Constitution was meant to do. And he wrote that into the opinion. And so now, because we're trying to write these flaws out of our foundations and pretend like, well, the foundations are good, we just had bad judges like Roger Taney. No, that's not the problem. Yes, let's not honor Roger. I have no problem. Let's take his bust down. What? Okay. So let's take his bust down. Let's not worry about it. Or let's not honor him. But let's also not pretend that that is the solution to the problem. These are foundational level problems. And we have to address it at a foundational level. This is the same thing you've heard me say before. The challenge with saying things like Black Lives Matter or Native Lives Matter. Yes, we need to affirm the value and the agency of African Americans and Native Americans? Absolutely. It doesn't address the fundamental lie, which is what our nation is built on, which is not primarily that Black and Native peoples are less than. It's that white people are greater than. So this is where we have to address not only, yes, Black Lives Matter, we have to just become just as comfortable saying white people are not superior. Because otherwise we have to find every little subcategory and affirm that, instead of addressing the lie behind the whole thing, which is the belief in white Anglo-Saxon purity and white supremacy. And so we can come up with a long list of all the people whose lives matter, which is true. But we can still say that and not address the foundational problem, which is we have this belief that white people are superior. That's the implicit bias. That's what we believe as a nation, and that's what we need to learn how to address. And so these are the things that I think we need to get better about working at. And then we see this as well in page 104, as not only has the Supreme Court ensconced white supremacy in the Dred Scott decision, but in 1823, the Supreme Court solidifies white supremacy in regards to land titles and in relationship to Native peoples, where they literally state that land titles are based on discovery, and then blatantly saying that natives have occupancy of the land, but because we're savages, we can never have the full title to the land. Now, it gets tricky because in this understanding of this type of white supremacy, because we see this type of white supremacy in here, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. What becomes problematic is the court cases regarding land titles. They acknowledge that natives have some rights to the land, the right of occupancy. We do have some agency. We do have some say over our land. But because the fee title, the right of discovery to the land, belongs to white people, that supersedes native agency, native sovereignty, native dominion over the land, and it grants it to the discovering white European nations. And so we see this play out. We don't go into this in depth in the book, but we see this play out throughout our history where all of these European nations, most of our NATO allies, right, they were swarming over here and discovering these lands. Not only Columbus, but France and other nations were discovering these lands. At one point, France was the largest colonial holder in North America. Because the rule was when you landed at a river, when you discovered a river coming into the sea, you were discovering all of the land to the side of that river. And so when the French landed and discovered the Mississippi River, and then they claimed all of that land going up and to the west. And then in 1803, when they sold the Louisiana Purchase, right? They sold that land to the United States of America. So they claimed that right of discovery. They didn't even really explore or do much with any of that land, but they sold it for a few $1 million to the United States in the early 1800s. And the U.S. was able to purchase all of this land at a bargain. So now they were purchasing the right of discovery, the fee title to these lands. The natives living on the land still had their own agency. But the rule was that you could only sell the land. You could only make treaties over the land. You could only do things with the discovering entity. And so what this meant is that basically the U.S. government, or the discovering nation, had a monopoly over the value of those lands. And the nation didn't have the agency to do whatever it wanted to do with those lands. And so this is, again, where this implicit bias comes in, which is that of the white superiority and the native inferiority. And so we see the Dred Scott decision, and we see the Johnson v. McIntosh decision in the early to mid 1800s, which really solidify the lie of white supremacy. Now, what's fascinating is around the same time, and actually, again, there's a little bit of about 25, almost 30-year gap between the two cases. So it's after 1823 when this ruling and land titles truly become based on white superiority and their discovery of these lands. And then that's where we begin to see more blatant expressions of the ethnic cleansing and genocide of this nation. We see it first with we talk about the state of Georgia, and then we go into the Indian Removal Act by Andrew Jackson, and then the Long Walk and the removal of these native nations from their land in the East. And what's fascinating, right, is they're saying we have the right to move you to other lands that are not territories yet. Again, they're still claiming that they have the right to give those lands away, regardless of what other native nation may already be living there, which they were doing frequently. They were giving away lands that were not theirs to give away. They did the same thing to them after they ended chattel slavery, and they made this promise to African people of 40 acres and a mule. Again, they're promising acres that are not theirs to give, but the U.S. government does this all the time. This is how their superiority, their lie of white supremacy begins to become an implicit value, implicit part of the way they see their life in this new world. And so it's with the removal and the claiming of these lands, coupled with the belief of superiority, that we began to see the genocide being enacted. And again, without remorse, because this is a religious fervor, this is a religious belief, because there's the precedent of promised lands, where when you have promised lands, you have God's right to ethnically cleanse those lands. And so we see this diseased theological understanding begin to play itself out as the nation works to begin to claim these lands, to remove natives from lands in the East, to empty lands further in the West. And we see that in the state of California, when that becomes a state in the 1850s, and the mass genocide that begins to take place there, and even the acknowledgement by Governor Peter Burnett, who acknowledges they are actively committing genocide and has no intention to stop it and says they can't even stop it until they're all dead. This is the problem with this implicit racial bias. And so on one hand, this chapter is very shocking because it literally details the thinking of our nation and how it justifies genocide of Native peoples. So if you were just to pick up this chapter and read it without any of the prior context, this chapter would be very shocking. But because you've had the context of the 6 chapters prior to this, and you see how this diseased social imagination and these theological imagination, these dysfunctional understandings get wrapped up in each other, how the superiority begins to play out. Chapter 7 is really just the next progressive step. Now, what's fascinating is as that is happening with Native peoples, and as our genocide and ethnic cleansing, the genocide and ethnic cleansing of our communities becomes more and more explicit, we see the manifestation of this white supremacy with the African American community become more implicit. Whereas prior, they were brought here intentionally as people less than human and kidnapped and brought here and enslaved and forced to build up this nation. And then as that system began to break down, we see it, the Dred Scott decision is really at the height of where this country states, yes, not only are these people able to be enslaved, but they were never intended to be citizens of this nation. They have no agency. They have no rights here. And then we see the nation begin to wrestle with that a bit more. And then in the 1860s, we see, again, slavery is not abolished. It's just moved from an explicit manifestation to an implicit manifestation. We get rid of chattel slavery, and now we put it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. And so we're moving it from the explicit to the implicit. Meanwhile, we are still explicitly getting better at mass murdering and ethnically cleansing our native peoples. But we're becoming more implicit with our treatment of African Americans, our African people. And I can't, we give several examples of this in this chapter. The example of California, the example of Wounded Knee, the example of the 425 medals of honor that are given out by this nation, right? So our country is explicitly enacting genocide, feeling no remorse about that, and even celebrating that. We'll see that in the chapters coming up. But this is just the next step. When you have these implicit racial biases, when you have this assumed sense of your own superiority, when you have this understanding that you are on a mission for God and you have a manifest destiny and all these things happen, and then as you see these obstacles come up in your way, other people are on your land and you're not able to do the things you're supposed to do, and so you have to meet these challenges through ethnic cleansing and through all these policies and keep your narrative of your own superiority alive. This chapter is really just trying to highlight how this is the next step. When you have this dysfunctional of a theology, this dehumanizing of a worldview, this blatant lie of your own supremacy, enslavement, exclusion, dehumanization, even ethnic cleansing and genocide are the natural progressive next steps. That's just what happens. This Sunday, I'm preaching at a church in Virginia. It's a virtual service. And for this service, I'm looking at two of the passages in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus warns his disciples. The disciples come to him and they found this guy who was casting out demons, and they've told him to stop because he's not a part of their select group, and they're feeling pretty proud of themselves. And Jesus says, don't stop them, for anyone who gives you a cup of water in my name won't lose their reward. But then he goes on and he says, if you cause one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it'd be better if you tied a millstone around your neck and jumped into the ocean. He says, if your hand causes you to believe you're better than someone else, cut it off. It's better to go into life maimed than with two hands to be thrown into hell. If your eye causes you to believe you're better than someone else, gouge it out, Jesus said. It's better to go into life blind than with two eyes to be thrown into hell. And the question of my sermon is, are these threats of Jesus, are these hyperbole? Right? Is he just exaggerating and playing something way out of proportion to drive home a point? Or is he serious? Again, going through the chapters of the book, going through the heresy of Christendom, going through the belief in promised land, going through the root of white supremacy, going through writing it into our foundations, and then going through the process of not only building up these lands, but claiming them. And the necessary step when you believe in your own superiority over and above the livelihood and the humanness of others, enslavement, genocide, ethnic cleansing, are natural progressive steps. And so I would argue Jesus wasn't using hyperbole. He was deadly serious. When he saw his disciples begin to take on this attitude that may have felt harmless in the moment, but he knew if that seed were to be planted, take root, and grow, the flourishing of that seed would look probably very similar to what happened here on Turtle Island, when this heresy of Western Christianity came here believing in their own superiority, believing they had a covenantal relationship with the God of Abraham, believing they were exceptional, and that they had been given a manifest destiny, which then makes the stories of chapter 7 not only the beginning, where someone would say, yeah, if it was legal, I would absolutely own slaves, and the end, where a nation is literally handing out medals of honor for soldiers who participated actively in the process of ethnically cleansing these lands. I know there were a few questions being asked throughout there, so I'm going to scroll through some of the questions in the chat and take a look. If you have a question you'd like to ask about this chapter, I welcome you to put it into the comment section. If you're on Facebook or on YouTube, they will show up on my console here, and I can answer any questions. Stephen Wilson asked, would you say, at least as far as America is concerned, the foundational source of racism is white supremacy? I don't think I would say that. I think the racism and the sense of superiority, unfortunately, I would say this is a human trait. This is a common human trait that we see. I would say the challenge with it in Western civilization, and especially Western church, Western religious beliefs, is they have done probably the best job of any group of institutionalizing it, of justifying it, of writing a theology around it, and of actually making it acceptable. So I would say it's not the only example of racism and belief in supremacy, not by a long shot. This exists. I think this is a part of, I would say, the human condition. But Western culture and the heresy of Western Christianity, the heresy of Christian empire, did an incredibly good job of making this belief systemic, of institutionalizing it, of writing theologies around it, and of justifying it and selling it to people so that it became literally acceptable. So it's not the only example, but it is far one of the most pervasive examples of what happens when you allow this way of thinking to run rampant for so long. And this is one of the challenges that I think we face as a nation, is because this implicit racial bias is still deeply, deeply a part of the American belief system today. right? This is why even World War II, right? We feel no remorse as a nation that we killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese people by dropping a nuclear bomb on them. Our nation feels no remorse for that whatsoever. This is what happens. In the coming chapters, we're going to look at how not only was Abraham Lincoln one of the most ethnic cleansing and genocidal presidents in our nation's history, but he actually established a national holiday, Thanksgiving, to celebrate the fruits of that genocide. And the nation went along with him. We still celebrate it today in his honor. But if you read his first Thanksgiving Day proclamation, he was literally giving thanks for the fruits of ethnic cleansing and genocide. So, yeah, our nation is not the first. We're not the only group of people who have had this dysfunctional belief system. But Western Europeans and white Christians have done an unbelievably effective job of institutionalizing it, of writing theologies around it, and of passing it off as normal and even acceptable. Good question, Steve. I appreciate you asking that. I'm looking at a few more questions here. Adam asks, as the white population is transitioning from a majority group to a minority in the nation, how might this impact the dominating system? White supremacists appear to feel a threat. And I think this is the problem. I think you're absolutely onto something here, Adam. So we have deeply white supremacist, racist, and sexist foundations. And because white men have been in the majority for so long, they've been able to keep this system in place and actually make it feel fairly acceptable and fairly status quo. But there absolutely is. There's actually a date, I forget the exact date, where it's expected that the white majority will become a white minority. And that is terrifying for our white brothers and sisters because they know what they've done. They know how they've treated other people, and they are terrified of being held accountable for that or even having some of that treatment be directed towards them. Right? This is again, this goes back to the trauma of white America, which we'll talk about in a few chapters. But what's I think is fascinating is as the white majority becomes a minority, we are going to see more of what's been taking place in the last few years, right? So you can easily make the case that the way we do elections and the Electoral College in the United States is based on racism and white supremacy. It's meant to minimize the representation and the voice of marginalized people and to maximize the influence of the white landowning male. That is the purpose of the Electoral College. We have the Second Amendment, right? The right to bear arms, to keep and bear arms. This was absolutely written to help the white landowning male protect their property, the people they were enslaving, as well as to protect their families and communities from the merciless Indian savages. The Second Amendment was not written to grant the right to keep and bear arms to people of color. That's not why we have a Second Amendment. It was written to protect their investment in enslaved peoples, and it was written to protect their lands from the merciless Indian savages. Now, in the past. So, and immigration the same way, right? Immigration was not written to allow people of color to come into this land. It was written to keep them out and to allow more white people to come in. Again, all these things. Two of our past 4 elections, the winner of our presidency lost the popular vote, right? 2 of our last 4 elections, the winner of our presidency lost the popular vote. And both times, the winner of that election was the person who was more explicitly racist and sexist and white supremacist. They were both white land. All 4 of them were about white landowning men, or white landowners. Second one also involved Hillary Clinton. But the winner in each of those was the white landowning male from the 1% who was more explicitly committed to racism, sexism, and white supremacy. What I'm fairly convinced of is the system was rigged, was written to protect the group in power, white landowning men. As they become the minority rather than the majority, and they're not able to keep these things in place merely by what appears to be a facade of democracy, we will see more egregious examples of them keeping power through more violent and harmful means. And I would say that the terrorist attack on the Capitol was a prime example of this, right? A prime example. I can't even stress how important this is to understand. Had that attack been initiated and perpetrated by people of color, we would have a bipartisan, unanimous commission looking into it. We would have had fully armed guards with military level equipment protecting that Capitol. There would have been no one walking out of the building once it was over. It would have been surrounded by a massive force of military strength. And the people who perpetrated that crime were the people of color would not be getting treatment in prisons, transfers so they could eat the dietary foods of their choice, permission to go on vacations, even though, right? None of this would be happening. The reason our nation was so ill prepared for the terrorist attack on January 6th is because the threat was coming from white people. That's why. If the threat was coming from people of color, they would have been, I can't even think what would have happened if that would have been the case. And so, again, this is the challenges, is as the white minority becomes a white minority, we're going to see them using these systems they put in place to more explicitly protect themselves, even giving up the facade. Right now, we have the facade of we're a democracy. We have the facade of we believe that everyone's equal. That's not going to be the case. It's going to just become more and more egregious as the white landowning men do everything possible to maintain their hold on power. I truly believe that's what's going to happen. They are not going to give up their chokehold on power just because they've become the minority. We will see our nation, if we don't do something to address this at a foundational level, we will see the white landowning male from the 1% use more and more of these slicks that they've written into their foundations so they can continue to hold on to power, so that the foundations will not hold them accountable, right? If President Obama had spoken the same way President Trump spoke, if he had incited the same movements President Trump incited, do you literally think there would be any chance that he would be pondering a run for a second term in office? Not a chance. Would never happen. But now we have Donald Trump sitting in his home in Mar-a-Lago, pondering, playing kingmaker for the Republican Party. Only because he's white. If he were any other color of skin, even if his suntan lotion worked better. No, I'm not going to say that. If any other leader who was not a white landowning male from the 1% tried to do what Donald Trump is doing, he would be removed by unanimous consent. I have no doubt in my mind whatsoever. So I think we're just going to see these equities become more and more egregious as the white majority becomes the white minority and realize they have to get more blatant in order to hold on to their power. That's my thought. That's my expectation of what's going to happen. Any other questions here? I'm looking through. I think we've gotten to the end of the questions. There's some other good comments in there. Thank you, everyone, for making comments on this. This, to be honest, this was a difficult talk for our study for me to prepare for. Just because I wasn't quite sure how to handle all the ethnic cleansing and genocide. And it's so implicit that our nation oftentimes doesn't even know what it's doing, right? If you listen to, I gave a second cup of coffee earlier today, and I talked in that second cup of coffee about the way we're leaving Afghanistan. And right, the Biden administration is trying very hard to say, okay, the me first mentality, the American first mentality of the Trump administration, that's all in the past. America is back. We're going to become global leaders with integrity. We're going to become the America everybody knows and loves. And yet the way that we are leaving Afghanistan is despicable. We are literally leaving Afghanistan, and the way we pulled out of the Afghan air base this past week, leaving it with rotting food, vehicles with no keys, not even telling the Afghan government when we left, leaving it open, leaving it for looters to come in and just take over. And then justifying our behavior by saying it was for the security of our troops. Again, the security of our troops take precedence over the agency and the humanity of the Afghan people whose nation we were in. And we left, well, you could argue it wasn't explicitly violent, but it was so over the top inconsiderate, and to be honest, just flat out rude, that it highlights this belief in our own superiority. It's the same way you would think a self-indulged, pompous, arrogant, gluttonous person staying at a fancy resort hotel would treat the people of color working as the support staff there. That they could make whatever mess they wanted to make, that they could do whatever they wanted to do. They felt that level of entitlement, and the people who work there would just be happy to come behind them and clean up. The way we left trash, rotting foods, useless vehicles, and didn't even have the decency to have a proper handoff of that base to the Afghan government. It speaks volumes about what we think of ourselves and what we think of them. And that's the problem. This belief in our own supremacy, in white supremacy, the belief in American exceptionalism is so implicit. I'm sure Biden wasn't even aware what he was doing. In fact, the way the U.S. military covered that in their news service was that we handed off. We had a handoff of that base. That's a flat-out lie. There was no handoff. It was a self-protecting, cowardly retreat by a nation that doesn't have the courage to own what it did and to treat the nation it was occupying for 20 years as equals. And so that's the challenge, is these beliefs of supremacy and exceptionalism are so absolutely implicit that our leaders aren't even aware of them. And it becomes very hard to know how to address. How do we deal with these sorts of things? So anyway, that's some of the challenges of this chapter. Is our nation is by and large blind to these issues. And we're blind, right? And even not just the Republicans, right? This was the Biden administration, the one who was saying the America's back, right? You can say, you could have signs and T-shirts, even underwear. You could have billboards, Native Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. You can put all that stuff up, right? And still believe white people are superior. That's the problem. Joe Biden is much better about saying things like Black Lives Matter. But he still absolutely 100% believes that white people are superior. And he demonstrated that. He demonstrated that in how he pulled out of the Afghan air base. That is what's so difficult to know what to do with. Because the nation, at least the majority of the nation, will be up in arms about what's going on with the Trump administration. But they will be much less engaged to call out what's going on with the Biden administration. Anyway, these are my thoughts, my relatives. Unsettling Truth, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. I hope you found this conversation helpful. I really enjoy these times to talk at these things a little bit more in depth. I hope you have a great weekend. And I will be back next week with some more sunrise videos, as well as with my second cup of coffee. And then, of course, next week, Friday, we'll go over chapter 8 and looking at the next chapter of this book. So, Ahiahat, my relatives, I hope that you have a great weekend. Walk in beauty, and may we learn how to walk in beauty together. Ahiahat and Hakonet.